Very good. So I don't know, I'll try to blow through some of the background pictures. I don't know how much people know about Oak Park. Oak Park is a community of 52,000 people immediately adjacent to Chicago to the west. I would often refer to Oak Park as somewhat like Evanston in that it's 52,000 people with 53,000 opinions. So it's sort of a very engaged community. Oak Park is known for a number of things. It is a community that was Frank Lloyd Wright's playground. And so there's a larger number of Frank Lloyd Wright structures in Oak Park than any other municipality. He lived there for 20 years. He also sort of led this architectural revolution, which has manifested itself now in a situation where you kind of can't throw a rock in Oak Park without hitting an architect. And so there's a lot of concern, a lot of interest in design issues and other things. We also, so the architectural history of Oak Park is an important component of the community. Teens, 20s, lots of new development, and really sort of helped to change architecture in the country and the world. 40, 50 years later, we ended up actually also again serving as a source of significant change with respect to the creation of an inclusive community, a racially inclusive community that was focused on intentional integration to the point where Oak Park is today the most successfully diverse city in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But this idea of it being sort of at the core of change is a central element, one of the identifying features that many Oak Parkers sort of think of themselves as embodying, that there's not a fear of change, there's an openness to it, and also an openness to seeing the work that can be done on a small scale as having a much bigger impact. So here's just a quote really quickly. 5 centuries ago, a tiny handful of enlightened city-states from Tuscany lifted Europe from the dire circumstances of the Dark Ages and made Western civilization the dominant culture of the planet. This one little region gave law to the English, science to the Germans, food to the French, and electrified the world with its art, literature, and architecture. That whole idea of, at a small level, we can make changes that can have a dramatic impact elsewhere. And I think that that's the work that CIF is interested in doing. That's the work that all of you are interested in doing. My purpose in being here is to try to have a little bit of a conversation about how that can be made to happen. So again, just on a regional basis, this is a development map for Chicago. This is 1900. It gives you a sense of where all of the developed areas are. And in essence, you can see sort of a crescent around the core of Chicago, a number of radiating spokes. If you actually track those back, they go back to the original Native American transit points. And then we subsequently built roads along those. And you ended up seeing a lot of development around it. And then you've got one here that's along the Fox River. But that's 1900. That's 1950. It's essentially the same crescent, a little bit further out, but you can still see the radiating spokes. You can still see the development along the Fox River. And so those development patterns are relatively static. So that's a 50-year split. Now, when you go from 1950 to 2005, it's sort of like somebody took peanut butter and sort of spread it across the entire map, right? So the question becomes, well, 1950 or 1900 to 1950 is 50 years. 1950 to 2005 is 55 years. It's not that big a difference. Like, what happened? So we built the interstate highway system. And when we built the interstate highway system, we facilitated the proliferation of folks out into areas where they had not historically lived. And we also facilitated out-migration. And in many cases, here in the Chicago metro area in particular, we also facilitated white flight with population changes that were occurring. So that, and I just want to give you this background just to be able to sort of understand this aspect of life in Oak Park. This is a map of the concentrations of African American population on a block by block basis that exceeded 25% in 1964. So you see the Austin neighborhood area of Chicago, which is immediately adjacent to Oak Park, did not have any block that was in excess of 25% African American in terms of population mix in 1964. But as many who are from this region know, rapid racial resegregation occurred during the 1960s and 1970s in both the southern and western portions of the city, and then into the suburban areas as well. So this is Austin, the Austin community area, where from 1960 to 1970, the change in these census tracts was from 0 to 0. It essentially stayed the same. It was all white. From here, it went from 0 to 91%, 73%, 20, 67, 95, 80. So there was significant change in a decade's time. Here's what this looks like on a map. And that the change that occurred was on a block-by-block basis, okay? And so when you look at, these are just different concentrations in excess of 75%, 50%, 25%. But what's going on here? There's nothing going on above this line, okay? That, to me, is the most significant map of what racism looks like to me that I've sort of ever seen. And I gave this presentation at one point to the Congressional Black Caucus talking about that, that hard line was saying, you are not welcome here, okay? The reason I wanted to talk about this is because the outgrowth of this led to a focus in Oak Park on intentional diversity and integration that has expanded in definition over the course of the last 50 years to not simply be about race, but to also be about the inclusion of different populations that have not historically been thought about, not historically been considered, not historically been included, and how we can think more intentionally about actually welcoming, including, and embracing folks that represent the entire diaspora of American society. So I'll just sort of run through these. This is Oak Park at the same time, 1960 to 1970, and it's still in 1970, it's still virtually 0%. But by 1973, this is a map in August of 73, the larger circles were blocks where there were at least 5 households, and then a smaller dot is a single household. And there were efforts that were made to be able to ensure that this block-by-block racial resegregation didn't spread into Oak Park on a block-by-block basis, but instead, the community as a whole said, look, we think we've got a great community here. We think everybody ought to be able to live in this community. And we think that nobody should feel like they are limited simply to an area that is adjacent to an area where there's someone else who looks like them. They should be able to live anywhere they want. And so a number of specific efforts were undertaken to be able to help facilitate that, one of which was the creation of the organization that I now run, which is the Oak Park Residence Corporation. The Residence Corporation was set up to be able to encourage high-quality multifamily housing that encouraged diversity and that encouraged affordability. So that is the mission of the organization that's now been in place for 52 years to be able to try to help make sure that we're meeting the goals that we were established to be able to create. It's led to a community that there are 284 municipalities in northeastern Illinois in the 6-county area. At one point when I was still in office, we sort of did a 10-year comparison. We had seen greater price appreciation than any of the other 283 municipalities. My argument around that is that that's because there are more people who want to live in a place that looks like the world than there are places that look like the world. And so in my professional background as a management consultant, and my characterization of that is that diversity, intentional diversity, can be a source of competitive advantage for municipalities. But people need to understand it, and they need to be able to get beyond the fear issue, and they need to be able to see it as an opportunity. So this is just a picture of a core downtown area that we made some physical investments in, significant physical investments in improving with, brick street, bluestone sidewalks, granite curbs, original forged lighting, et cetera. We've seen almost $500 million in investment in new housing in that downtown area, okay, since 2007 when we did this project. The Residence Corporation and the Housing Authority, these are a number of key things about us. We're a community-based nonprofit. 52 years of operation. We've rehabbed more than 25 multifamily buildings. We currently own and manage 22, about 457 units. We also are affiliated with the Oak Park Housing Authority. Through that, we run both the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which has in excess of 500 vouchers in Oak Park, and also has multiple hundreds of public housing and multifamily housing units, including a building that we'll see in a moment, which is dedicated to persons with disabilities. So Mills Park Tower is a 198-unit building. It's located sort of on the edge of our downtown area. It's situated right on a park and is predominantly, almost exclusively for seniors. There is a population of 10% of folks who would fall into the category of persons with disabilities, a significant proportion of whom are actually seniors as well. The Oaks, this building is adjacent to my office, and this is a 75-unit building also for seniors. This is a HUD 202 building for those who trade in HUD lingo. So these 75 units, this again is predominantly for seniors, but also open to persons with disabilities. And this is the Farley Muriello apartment building, which was created explicitly to be able to help serve the needs of persons with disabilities. It opened its doors in 1994, houses 21 units for individuals who are persons with disabilities, but who have the ability to be able to live in an independent setting. Showalter House. I was a few minutes late actually getting up here because I was on the phone with one of the members of our city council who was calling me because we have something on the agenda for this coming Monday, and she was, these are the good kinds of calls to get. She was saying, "Are you sure? Don't you need more money than that?" Those are the good questions. Those are the good sorts of inquiries that you want to be able to get. The way that we get, and I'll talk about this just for a minute. So Showalter House opened also in the early 90s and was set up as a facility for individuals with HIV and AIDS. And it was originally through an organization called Vital Bridges, which then joined with and became part of Heartland Housing, for those from the area who would know Heartland. Heartland just recently, just last year, at the end of last year, and they carried through their management of this for the first few months of this year, made a decision because of changes in HIV and AIDS treatment protocols that they wanted to shift to a scattered site model rather than a group home model or a congregate housing model as we have here. So this has 5 units in the front building. There's a 3-bedroom coach house in the back. So when they made that decision, we then, through the Oak Park Housing Authority, approached Housing Forward, which is formerly West Suburban PADS, with the idea of creating a structure and an approach that could be used to be able to house persons who are transitioning out of homelessness or who are at risk of becoming homeless. And we could have 6 units that could be used as interim housing, where people would be for 60 to 90 days, and then could be used to be able to help transition them into permanently supportive housing units. So we're in the process of working through that right now with our city council and getting the support that's necessary both on a physical investment capital side and an operating side. But having those sorts of conversations with folks about, hey, how much of a check do you really need, is a really good place to be able to be in these conversations. This is actually a gentleman who was one of my predecessors who was a moving force behind helping to be able to make the Farley Muriello apartment building a reality. Frank was deeply committed to this, but also was very adept at being able to work with individuals who were decision makers in elective office and in other situations to be able to help address the needs that exist in the community. So I want you to think for a moment about a box. And I want you to divide the box into two columns. I want you to divide the two columns into two rows. Okay? And I call this community societal perspective. This is what I was referring to earlier. The first time I put this together, actually, I was presenting this to a mayor's conference and presented it as a mayor's view of the world. And then I actually sort of changed that and said, no, this isn't really just a mayor's view of the world. This is just actually how the world really is. And so one column is people. Thoughts on the other column? Places. And on the rows, micro and macro. Okay. So, folks have any ideas? What's in the people micro box? Family? Yeah, yeah. These are basically things that I might get approached in the grocery store by people to sort of talk about. Social services, health services, economic support, educational support, constituent services, and one-on-one engagement. Thank you so much that the firefighters came out and got my cat out of the tree. That sort of thing, okay? Next, people and macro. What are we thinking about there? Okay, maybe recreation services. Transportation services. Safety services. So these actually, the way that I've sort of framed this is, these are the things that essentially determine or define, help to define what our culture is. So the economy, public health, public safety, diversity, cultures and traditions, public engagement, education, and creativity and beauty in the form of music and theater and the arts. Okay? The things that we think of that help to define who we are as a people, if you will. Okay? Places, micro. Thoughts? Yeah, so places on the micro level, this is not anything bigger than maybe a corridor. And most of the time, this is the sort of thing that, you know, the reference to NIMBY came up earlier. This is boom, right in that box. That's right what we're talking about. This is a development proposal or whatever. This is what we're going to have World War III about in front of a zoning commission. So economic development, corridor planning, placemaking, zoning overlays, special taxing districts, all of those things are at the micro level, site-specific things. But then on the places level at the macro, we've got infrastructure priorities, transportation, land use and zoning, housing, public art programs, parks and open space, natural resources, and environmental sustainability. So the reason why I put all this together is to be able to help provide a little bit better frame for what the person you may be talking with on the other side of the table is thinking about in total. And the argument that I've made on any number of occasions in front of many different groups is, if you're arguing about one of these bullet points, you're losing. And the reason I say that is because the person on the other side of the table is not thinking about only one of these bullet points. They're thinking about all of these bullet points. And so when you are looking to be able to try to actually achieve something in the area that you are most concerned about, in my experience, the thing that is most likely to actually yield results is for you to be able to put yourself in the frame of mind of the person who you're talking with and understand what is it that they're trying to achieve, and how can you look at structuring what you're trying to do in a way that helps them to be able to advance some of the additional goals that they have. and allows you to be able to get to that whole idea of sort of win-win. Because the alternative is you're showing up and saying, housing for persons with disabilities is critically important and you ought to support it in this specific instance. And they may be sitting back and saying, I agree with that. That is really important. But I have a hard time saying that that's more important than the need to be able to support early childhood education, or the need to be able to support an intervention program for youth who are potentially engaged with gang activity, or it's a fundamental environmental concern because of runoff related to a development proposal. You've got lots of different folks who are showing up in their offices who want to talk about one thing. You are likely to be far more successful if you are engaging from the perspective of understanding what their needs are and what they're trying to do and what you can do to be able to help that. So, and I lied, it's not a square, it's a cube. So if we turn it, any thoughts on what the other dimension is? So this is time, and it's time, you know, right there it just looks like time and it just sort of continues on. But there are a bunch of artificial constraints. There's a quarterly report or an annual report in the private sector. There's a 2-year election cycle or a 4-year election cycle in the political structure. And being able to understand those things and the limitations that those can place, you want to be providing solutions that help to push through those and that are long-term solutions. So I want to sort of address just one example that I think might be helpful in thinking through a real-life situation related to this. There was a building, the Comcast building in Oak Park, vacant for 5 years, formerly used as regional Comcast office, deteriorating Drive-It concrete facade. Drive-It is a faux stucco material that is put up. It does not look good, and for the architectural purists in the world, it is one of those sort of hideous, if you could get rid of one thing on earth, what would it be? It would be Drive-It. Original design, actually that should be Albert Kahn, who was a leading edge architect, industrial architect out of Detroit. So in a community that cares about architecture, being able to rehab a building that was an Albert Kahn structure actually has some meaning. It's a half a block from high traffic, high visibility intersection, one of the main intersections in Oak Park that had been experiencing investment and maintaining further development potential. So you've got a development opportunity. Located on major commercial thoroughfare but adjacent to residential blocks, multi-unit and single-family homes. You can imagine how that goes over. So it's an abandoned building that's basically on a residential block, and you're going to end up with a proposal that's going to be controversial by virtue of what it was proposing, and then near parking and public transit. So there was a proposal that came forward from Interfaith Development Corp. Wanting to be able to develop affordable housing in this building. I was in office at this point. This is an article from the local paper that talked about a lot of it, but the key part I wanted to highlight is this part in green down here at the bottom. Ultimately, a woman, young woman, person with disabilities, came forward and spoke at the board meeting and said the following. Meredith Hill of the 500 block of South Grove told the group, I am a person with a disability, and I would like to be your neighbor in an apartment of my own. We already live here. We are your friends and neighbors. Let's face it, I don't want to live with my parents forever. I mean, that cut through in a way that people could hear and be like, oh yeah, like if that was me, I'd feel the same way. So an ability to be able to understand and get that messaging through, but also again, this is the old picture. This is what was being proposed, which was 51 affordable apartments for singles who live or work in Oak Park. IHDC, Oak Park Housing Authority, and Catholic Charities created a unique partnership to be able to develop a vacant former Cadillac LaSalle car dealership located in the village of Oak Park into 51 units of supportive rental housing for low-income adults with an emphasis on attracting persons with disabilities. It is a project, so it added on 2 stories, but it added on 2 stories in a way that was architecturally sympathetic to what actually was underneath the Drive-It facade. Once that was peeled back, we were able to sort of see a vision of what this could be. So we were looking at economic development because the ground floor ended up, there was a proposal to put in, ultimately it's become the Sugar Beet Food Co-op. It's a great store. To be able to redevelop the architecture in a way that was aesthetically pleasing, to increase pedestrian orientation in the area, to increase the total density in the area, and to provide for affordable housing needs and needs for persons with disabilities. So you started to punch through a number of those different bullet points that are in that earlier slide that I showed you, and you started to be able to pull people together around something to replace a project that was really dilapidated and an eyesore. Now, this didn't prevent there from being some real concerns on the part of some of the residents, but it did put enough people in seats to be able to support something like this, and this is what it ultimately looks like. And it's a fabulous building. This is just sort of an example that I wanted to get to be able to try to give a real-world perspective of that idea of being able to sort of put yourself in the shoes of the person who's across the table, understand what their needs are, and figure out how to be able to mold and shift and incorporate some of that thinking into the solution that you're trying to drive toward in a way that's ultimately going to be more likely to be successful and make getting through that process a lot less painful. So that's really what I wanted to focus on and touch on. I tried to go as quick as I could here. This is all my contact info, including my work number, my cell number, and that's my work email. So I'm happy to have people reach out to me, and also happy to take any questions that might be helpful.
Yeah.
So.